Hi, I'm Julia Hull, PhD candidate studying ecology and biology. I am so excited about this episode. I have 5 guests today, each bringing their own experience, expertise, and perspective. Each interview was amazing in its own right, but I could only use tiny bits of each interview to tell this story. So, 4 of the 5 interviews will be available on Patreon at patreon.com/WTFbiology. For $1 a month, you can get access to those full interviews and so much more bonus content. And you help me make the show a reality. So thank you so much to all the patrons. In this episode, my guests and I talk about issues faced by Rachel Carson. Even almost 60 years after her death, we still face a lot of the same issues. We talk about gender inequality, the need for good science communication, and of course, environmental issues. I didn't know that much about Rachel Carson before I started working on this episode. Now, like Dr. Aaron Muller from the first episode, Rachel Carson is one of my intellectual heroes, and I think a moral hero too. Welcome to What the Fuck Biologist. Last episode, I asked my guest, Dr. Aaron Muller, if there was a scientist who had changed the way that she thinks about science. His adamant answer was, quote, hands down, Rachel Carson, end quote. So today, I will examine the life and influence of Rachel Carson and why she's such a badass, because hoo boy, she's a total badass. If you missed the previous episode, go back and check it out. Aaron and I talked about a fungal disease of white pines that was possibly axopurposely introduced to North America, the weird as fuck life cycle that thing has, and how foresters and homeowners deal with it now that we're stuck with it. But now, Rachel Carson, what the fuck, biologist? Rachel Carson authored arguably the most influential books on environmental issues in the 20th century. She won a National Book Award for her 3rd book, The Sea Around Us. She was inducted into the Academy of Arts and Letters. She received a multitude of awards. A complete list can be found simply by Googling her name. I want to talk about how Rachel Carson's writings have influenced all of our lives. Her legacy lives in the Environmental Protection Agency, Earth Day, and a domestic ban on the synthetic insecticide DDT. Rachel and other environmentalists helped us gain a new perspective on nature and humankind's relationship to it. Rachel's 4th and most well-known book, Silent Spring, has sold over 6 million copies and has been translated into 30 languages since its publication in 1962. The 1960s was an incredible decade for environmental awareness and activism in the United States, Canada, and lots of other places. In order to get a better perspective on Rachel's influence and legacy, I called up one of my old botany professors.
I'm Gene Bosniak, and I'm a retired botany professor after teaching for 45 years at Weber State University.
Which is where I did my undergrad.
Dr. Eugene Bosniak, or simply Boz, taught at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah for 45 years and was the chair of the botany department for, well, it was a long time, decades probably. At any rate, as a freshly minted PhD and as a brand new professor, Boz developed a course called Environment Appreciation. If you called it Environmental Appreciation, he would get after you. This class, deeply rooted in the concepts and principles in Silent Spring and those of Barry Commoner, like Carson, was a leader in environmental revolution in the 1960s. Commoner was also the chair of the botany department at Washington University at St. Louis, where Boz earned his PhD.
And that's what I brought to Weber State. When I came to Weber State, folks knew that I had some background and connection with Barry Commoner, and so they said, why don't you develop a course in environmental science? And I said, I don't want to do an environmental science course. And they asked me why, and I said, I felt that environmental awareness had to be broader than just environmental science. It wasn't just scientists that were contributing to decisions, but other disciplines as well. So in making the evolution from environmental science to something else broader than that, I thought, why not environment appreciation, using the noun, not the adjective? After all, there was an art appreciation class, a music appreciation class, and I thought, why not environment appreciation? Because therein was the crux of the need for environmental awareness. We didn't appreciate the environment enough. Obviously, understanding the environment was key to appreciating it. So I could contribute from the science end of things, but I wanted it to include other disciplines and subdisciplines from the humanities, from the social sciences, from engineering, virtually from any discipline. I felt that they had a stake in assessing environmental problems and contributing to solutions to them. So that's why the Environment Appreciation course was named as it was. So that was the class that began in 1971, and I taught it for 45 years.
This course, Environment Appreciation, was, and maybe still is, the cornerstone of one of the few remaining botany departments in the United States. This is the course that got me to change from meteorology to botany. And oh man, am I so glad that I did. Do you know how much calculus meteorologists have to do? Like what Rachel did in Silent Spring, Boz did in Environment Appreciation. He, like Rachel, made the environment a personal thing, not separate, not outside oneself, but of oneself. Rachel, Carson, and Boz both made connections to seemingly disparate issues. As one example, Rachel, in Silent Spring, showed us the step-by-step connection of synthetic pesticides to human health. Boz has boiled down everything he knows about ecology, which is a lot, into 4 laws of ecology. The first being, everything is connected to everything else. I'll let Boz give us an extreme example.
If everything is connected to everything else, then there's a connection between any two apparently disparate things. And I said, what is the connection between Soviet foreign policy and schistosomiasis? And first of all, students would say, what the hell is schistosomiasis? So we'd have to discuss that. I said that it was, another name for it is bilharzia, and it's very common in the tropics, a disease that many people died from. And it's associated with snails. Snails are an intermediate host for this parasite. But then students will say, well, there's no connection between that and Soviet foreign policy. And so the answer to that was that I was getting at the development of the Aswan High Dam. The Egyptians wanted this dam built, and they shimmied up to the Soviet, and the Soviet engineers built the dam rather than Western engineers. So when they built the dam, they stopped or slowed down the flow of water in the Nile and its tributaries, and that the snail population exploded, and we had an outbreak of schistosomiasis and killed a lot of people. So the connection was schistosomiasis habitat exploded with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, and so there was a connection between Soviet foreign policy and schistosomiasis.
Let's get a better picture of Rachel's journey so we can start to understand why she wrote Silent Spring. Rachel was born in 1907 in Springdale, Pennsylvania. Rachel's writing career began at the ripe old age of 10 when one of her works was published in a children's literary magazine. As a teenager, Rachel watched her little hometown turn from a sleepy small town to the epicenter of the iron and steel industries. 2 coal-fired power plants flanked the little town, resulting in grimy air and grimier river. This undoubtedly contributed to the imagery that opens her most influential book, Silent Spring. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, definitely get your hands on a copy. That first chapter, like the rest of the book, is really powerful. Rachel began a bachelor's degree in English at the Pennsylvania College for Women, now Chatham University. After a couple of years and some encouragement from a female biology professor, she took the dramatic step for a woman to major in science, specifically biology. Changing her major from English to biology did not prevent her from writing. In fact, Rachel said, science gave her something to write about. Rachel was an outsider to the scientific establishment, primarily because she was born a woman. Even now, roughly 90 years after the start of Rachel's scientific career, there is gender bias in science. In a report published November 5, 2019, the Royal Society of Chemistry found that women-led journal articles are underrepresented by about 15%, meaning that women-led articles are less likely to be published than articles led by a man. But they're not alone. The Institute of Physics and the biomedical journal eLife both self-report gender bias. But publication is not the only way that women face inequality. The wage gap between men and women is just as much of an issue in science as it is in other industries. Using government employee records obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, a large study examined 2.8 million employment records from the U.S. government science agencies from 1994 to 2008. This study showed that women earned significantly less than men doing the same job. According to their findings, in 1994, women earned 58 cents to every dollar that a man made doing the same job. Now, the good news is that by 2008, that number rose to 73 cents. The bad news is that vagina havers are still paid 73% of what they ought to be paid. I was starting to feel good about the progress that has been made toward gender equality since Rachel Carson's time. And then, the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed on December 11th, 2020. There, the author, Joseph Epstein, called for Dr. Jill Biden to drop the title of doctor. As a non-asshole would imagine, people were pretty damn pissed off.
Dr. Jill Biden, who today is now officially the First Lady of the United States, holds not one, but 2 master's degrees and a PhD in education, which she earned through hard work and perseverance, something that Joseph Epstein did not do.
That guy's an idiot and an asshole. But to see if he had a point about doctoral degrees getting easier, I called up a couple of professors at my university to get their take.
So in that op-ed that everybody was so mad about, including me, that Epstein guy, one of his arguments, besides the blatant misogyny, that getting a doctoral degree isn't as difficult as it used to be. In your 24 years of teaching, and do you think that that is a true statement?
No, definitely not. It's hard. I don't think
Yeah.
there's an easy way. Every PhD journey is going to be different. So I think he was very misinformed.
That was Northern Arizona University's Dr. Nancy Johnson, Regents Professor studying root-associated fungi. Check back for episode 8 for more about these critters. But let's see what Dr. Kristen Waring, who's a tenured professor in the School of Forestry at NAU, has to say about the alleged reduction of rigor in doctoral studies.
No, not at all. If anything, it's getting harder. There's more pressure on people to publish before finishing their PhDs.
And, as we just heard, there's gender bias in the papers that get published, and those that are cited. The number of first author papers a scientist has and how many times they're cited by other papers are important performance metrics for scientists and other academics.
It's unfortunate that a lot of the performance metrics, boil down to some things that really might not measure the right things. And I think they're trying to get more metrics now. I don't follow them. I don't really like all those numbers. It's like box scores in baseball. But I think that there's a lot of components of science that really require insights and creativity that is very difficult to measure until maybe years later.
Epstein's evidence for the reduction in rigor of doctoral degrees was a reduction in formality, students and advisors referring to each other on a first-name basis. This is what Nancy had to say about that.
I think that the best advisors, in the bigger scheme of things, are those people who consider their PhD students and their master's students and even their undergraduate students as colleagues. Mm-hmm. And actually embrace that these people are going to bring really different life experiences and really different insights and skills. And it's, I think, a very old model having, hair professor, the all-powerful, usually male figure in a white coat.
Right.
And you know what? That model is generally not going to be as productive as a more flat structure, no hierarchy, a flat structure of, who's the, person in charge, but everybody needs to be equally in charge of trying to solve these difficult problems. And everybody should feel free and liberated to come up with creative ideas of seeing the world and measuring it in different ways.
And all too often, that old model of hierarchy often leads to the misuse of power, which is what happened to Dr. Kristen Waring as she was doing her PhD.
So I made really poor choices with someone in a position of power, and it was actually really traumatizing and affected my confidence for over a decade.
Wow.
And so this particular person was preying on women who were vulnerable. That person went on to have similar relationships with other women, and it was also devastating to them. I didn't realize that it was happening with other women, and I don't know the total number, but 2 of us finally filed complaints, and he ultimately got kicked out of our professional society for an ethical breach. And I'm trying to be more open about my story, even though it could reflect poorly on me. But what I've been telling my students in particular when I talk about this is that we all need to pay a little bit more attention to what's going on. And if you think that something odd might be happening, you should probably ask some questions.
So we've been focusing a lot about gender issues, but that's not the only bias that's faced. So to talk about the intersection of race and gender, I brought in my friend Randy Swati, who works for the Nature Conservancy, and this is what he said.
God, that you throw on the lens of, minorities trying to make it in sciences, I can't imagine. So yes, there's a lot for all of us to do to help promote the work of everyone, and especially to empower females, to empower non-binary scientists of color. Yeah, huge. Lots of work. And I'm excited about that because, wow, there's so much we can all learn from each other, and having those diverse perspectives will only help us to better do what we need to do to make the world a better place.
And Boz loves to point out and question why biases exist.
We seem to have an insatiable need to create hierarchies. Biologists do that all the time. Mm-hmm. We also have such hierarchies created in our social construct. And this leads to inequalities, because when you start creating hierarchies, you...
By definition, something has to be higher and something has to be lower.
And have a higher value, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So the values are not equal. So that's the way we treat people as well as wildlife. So much for biases in biology.
Yeah. People keep say that, science is unbiased, but that's bullshit. Everything, everybody, every field, everything has bias.
Right.
And if you can recognize that,
that's the first step in correcting inequality, recognizing that they exist, that these biases exist.
So, it's not good that there's gender bias in the publication process. But these journals and societies have shown that they're interested in determining the degree of biases in their processes. That's a huge thing. A problem can't be fixed unless it's identified. So before we start hating on these journals and professional societies, let's remember that we can't fix something if we don't recognize that it's broken. And that's what these studies show, is that there is gender bias. The remaining question is, how do we get rid of it? So while we as a society have made major progress, there's still lots of work that needs to be done. The progress that was made by people like Rachel Carson, Madame Curie, and other scientific pioneers that happen to be vagina havers should not be underappreciated, nor should the fact that we still have a good way to go before women are paid what they're worth and don't have to fight a system that is rigged against them. But back to Rachel Carson. There were other factors that increased Rachel's outsider status besides gender. After completing her Master's of Zoology from Johns Hopkins University, she wanted to go on to earn a PhD, but she had to give up on that dream to support her widowed mother and orphan nieces. In addition to her family's circumstances, society was moving away from valuing biological sciences. In post-World War II America, biology was not held in high esteem. In 1950, President Harry Truman signed a bill that allowed for the formation of the National Science Foundation. At first, the agency was staffed by just 24 part-time members and was given about 1/10 of the money requested. At this time, World War II had just ended, and the Korean War was underway. Let's hear what Boz had to say about the effect of world wars on the perception of biology, ecology, and environmentalism.
World wars tend to assuage interest in environmentalism. You know, when it comes to a world war, we all hands on deck and conservation be damned. We need resources.
So this was the world that Rachel Carson was walking into as she was starting her career as a female biologist. With all these wars going on, NSF funding was pretty much for physicists, chemists, and engineers. And then, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite. There was little regard and less money for those who thought that bugs and plants and stuff was worth studying when there was space. After finishing her master's degree at Johns Hopkins University, Rachel landed a part-time job with the predecessor of the Fish and Wildlife Service, writing scripts for a radio program intended to increase public awareness and appreciation of aquatic life, as well as promote the role of the Fish and Wildlife Service. She continued to write as a freelancer. She often wrote for the Baltimore Sun, where she advocated for changes in oyster seeding and dredging practices and in governmental regulation due to water pollution. She signed her articles R.L. Carson, hoping that readers would assume that the writer was male and thus take the issues seriously. Because circumstances prevented her from obtaining a Ph.D., Rachel had no academic affiliation. After a distinguished career in the Fish and Wildlife Services, she eventually became the editor-in-chief for the entire agency. She became a full-time science writer with a target audience of the general public. This allowed her to focus on her true love of writing, but to also care for her niece's child after the child became orphaned. Those who didn't like to hear what Rachel Carson was saying dismissed her as not a real scientist. After all, she didn't have an academic affiliation or even a Ph.D., and she wrote books for the public. Well, I think that her legacy has determined that she is a real scientist and so much more. Here's Randy Swati again. And remember, it's still pandemic time, and so everyone's lives are still happening in the background, so you can hear Randy's son playing violin.
Rachel did an amazing job at, not only describing how DDT impacted, biodiversity, but she connected it right away in the first part of the book to people and kids and communities. And so it just made it feel like the big deal it is. I was going to say it's a much bigger deal, but it made it feel like the big deal it really is. It felt kind of holistic, right? It didn't feel like one person just railing against something. And you just felt like there was this concern. And so that's how it impacted me, was like, we have to connect our work to bigger things.
Rachel Carson, she started a revolution. And the way she started it was by writing such a beautiful book that it was completely accessible to everyone.
The COVID-19 pandemic and other recent events have revealed a huge divide between the general public and the scientific establishment. Many professional scientists who are knee-deep in jargon, technical language, and complicated algorithms have forgotten to talk to the general public.
I'm Melissa Sivany, and I'm the science reporter at KNAU, which is the local public radio station in Flagstaff, Arizona.
When I asked Melissa how she thinks that scientists do at communicating their science to the general public, she gave me a surprising answer.
But I think there's another question kind of behind that question, which is, are scientists responsible for communicating their work to the public? And I would argue maybe not, which I think is a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but this is why I think good science communication is really, really hard. And it takes time and it takes training, and your brain has to kind of work that way just as much as science itself is really hard. So asking scientists to do both, I think, is a little bit unfair, right? Some of them are going to be able to do both. They're going to have that gift and that interest. But some of them won't. And in a perfect world, I think scientists would be able to rely on science communicators, and they would work together as a team.
During my time as a PhD, the first thing that you do is learn the jargon and the nitty-gritty and the minutia. And then you have to unlearn speaking that way in order to talk to people that don't share that same vocabulary. And some people don't ever get there, and some people don't want to get there. And quite frankly, a lot of people don't need to get to that point where they have to translate back.
Yeah, exactly. And, and the jargon's important. Like, they have to learn the jargon because that serves a specific role when you're a scientist. So it's not like they can just skip that part, right?
There are so many roles for science communicators. For example, my new job is to help scientists communicate their science to the general public. Randy Swati, on the other hand, his job is to help scientists communicate effectively with other scientists.
The scientist-to-scientist communication is really important. For example, we have a data set that depicts biophysical settings. That's a term that you could easily get a PhD in ecology in and never hear that phrase. Never. You would never hear that phrase. When what that term means is historical ecosystem. That's what it means to me. So my job is oftentimes translating what these data sets are and what can and can't be done with them to other scientists.
You can have a PhD and still not understand the jargon of a very related field. So it's important to be able to have people whose job it is to, like you say, translate.
Now, more than ever, we need people like Rachel Carson that can bridge that chasm between the people who benefit from scientific advancement that happen to have backgrounds in other fields and the scientific establishment. With the jargon and complicated equations and whatnot, science can feel like a cool kid club where non-scientists aren't welcome. While there's definitely a need for highly technical reporting, there's also a need for taking that story that's buried in that technical journal article and making it something that anyone can relate to.
The story is always about the people and what they're excited about or what they're afraid of or whatever's going on with the people in the story. That's what you have to focus on.
Rachel was amazing at doing just that. She had a deep understanding of the scientific principles and could tap into the humanity that we all, scientists, historians, grocery clerks, what we all share. The Adventure Journal put it this way, quote, "This was Carson's secret weapon. She wrote so well, she transcended boundaries between farmers and urban readers, between scientists and casual readers," end quote.
Yeah, she's just so eloquent. Her writing is just beautiful.
As early as 1945, Rachel tried to raise the alarm about environmental damage caused by DDT and other synthetic pesticides with long-lasting effects. She publicly questioned the right of a government to subject their citizens to potentially harmful substances. She wrote, "Can anyone believe that it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life?" she asked. They should not be called insecticides, but biocides.
She wrote a book that changed the world we're living in for the better. She made it a healthier world.
In Silent Spring, Rachel elegantly laid out the pathos, logos, and ethos of environmental effects on pesticides, pollution, and other ecological issues with a call to action to prevent and reverse ecological damage.
And I don't know if you realize this, but she was dying of cancer while she wrote that.
Right, yeah, and she had to keep it completely silent. And because she didn't want the chemical industry people to know about that, because they would be able to use that as a way to discredit her and what she was writing.
Yeah.
This is just a personal vendetta, and see, you're just mad because you have cancer. Well, she probably was mad that she had cancer.
Yeah.
But she was looking outward, looking toward the future, and she did have her personal story too.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she started a revolution, and really the whole field of environmental sciences, I think, was jump-started by her.
Rachel quietly and courageously endured relentless attacks while battling cancer. Grassroots movements, inspired by Silent Spring, began across the U.S. and the world, especially in areas heavily affected by the overuse of pesticides. Rachel informed and inspired regular people to demand that science and government be held accountable. At some point, President John F. Kennedy took notice of Silent Spring. Federal and state investigations supported many of the claims of the book. In her testimony before Congress, she reiterated the most important message of the book, namely, quote, the right of the citizen to be secure in his own home against the intrusions of poisons applied by other persons." End quote. Rachel died of cancer in April 1964 at the age of 56. Rachel's quiet and sustained courage throughout her personal and professional life led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, Earth Day, and a domestic ban on the production of DDT. Perhaps her longest-lasting legacy is the shift in how the human body is perceived. She showed us that the human body is not separate from nature, but part of the vast ecology that binds all living things together. Dr. Aaron Muller from the White Pine Blister Rest episode told me, quote, "Silent Spring is the main reason I got into environmental science," end quote. In the introduction to the 50th anniversary edition of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's biographer, Linda Lear, writes, quote, "Silent Spring compels each generation to reevaluate its relationship to the natural world. Aaron and countless others are a testament that Silent Spring continues to be inspirational nearly 60 years after its publication."
But I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's just timeless, and it's just so beautifully written. This book is going to live forever.
That's it for What the Fuck, Biologist. You can learn more about Rachel Carson at rachelcarson.org. There's so much more about her life and her work that we didn't cover today. Be sure to join me again in 2 weeks when I talk to PhD candidate Sneha Vissa. She and I discuss all the little critters that get carried around by mountain pine beetles and what that means for the forests of North America, elk hiding in fog, and where not to leave condoms. A huge thanks to my guests this episode, Dr. Jean Bosniak, Dr. Nancy Johnson, Dr. Kristen Waring, Randy Swati, and Melissa Sivany. Melissa is the author of 2 books, with a third on the way. Under Desert Skies tells the story of how a small corner of Arizona became the Earth's ambassador to space. Mythical River is a lyrical mix of natural science, history, and memoir, questioning what it means to make a home in the American Southwest at a time when its most essential resource, water, is overexploited and undervalued. Links to these books and lots more are available at melissasivany.com, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Melissa's upcoming book, Brave the Wild River, tells the story of 2 botanists who didn't listen when they were told women don't belong in the Grand Canyon. These 2 remarkable but ordinary scientists made the first botanical survey of Grand Canyon in 1938, and I am so excited for this book. Randy Swati founded the Data Conservation Lab, where he mentors high school and undergraduate students. Randy, like Rachel, isn't a professor. This means that neither Randy nor his students have much access to funding the way a traditional academic setting provides. These are highly motivated kids who are interested in developing their skills to make the world a better place. And the best person to help them do that is one of the best people on the planet, Randy Swati. So a big thanks to everyone at the Data Conservation Lab, and check out their blog, and I'll put a link into the show notes for that. I will play the full interview with Dr. Jean Bosniak for episode 4, so look for that in your feed on February 17th. We talked about so much good stuff that I just didn't have room for in this episode. The full interviews of my other guests are available on Patreon at patreon.com/WTFbiology. For $1 a month, you'll get access to those interviews and tons more awesome bonus content. This episode's music is titled The Seed by Ron Deckert. This song was chosen because Rachel Carson was a seed to the environmental revolution. Find Ron's music on SoundCloud. All my sources for the wage gap and publication bias are in the show notes. Check out my YouTube channel and be sure to subscribe. There are 2 WTF Biology YouTube channels. One is in Russian, and as I don't speak Russian, that one isn't mine. You'll find cool-ass nature shit videos. These videos are a couple minutes long, and I show you around the forest by my house or wherever I happen to be, and I point shit out that I think is cool. The topic of the videos relate to the topic of the podcast. In the first video, you'll see one of Aaron's research subjects, a southwestern white pine that now lives in my front yard. I like to pet it when I drink wine in the evenings. And if you want more cool-ass nature shit videos, you can pop over to patreon.com/WTFbiology. For $5 a month, you'll get access to at least one bonus cool-ass nature shit video each month, plus all the other dope bonus content, like the full interviews from today's episode. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WTF_biology. If you have questions Or if you know some fucky stuff about biology, drop me a line at wtfbiology@gmail.com, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.